main question I want to focus on is whether there have been unnecessary costs that have been incurred as a result of the pandemic, or shall we say, the response to the pandemic, both in India and in the world. And not only have there been unnecessary costs, but are there do we anticipate that there will be unnecessary further costs as a result of the particular form that that response has taken? Now, first, by way of presenting some of the context, I think it might be useful just to look at the picture of the total confirmed COVID-19 deaths. This is, of course, confirmed according to the WHO criteria, about which there is some controversy, both with respect to definitions of cases and of deaths, but nevertheless, I'm just going to take that without question for this purpose. If we look at the trend in the world as a whole and the total level attained as of January 25th, there were more than 2 million confirmed deaths. And you will see that the vast majority of those were not in the developing countries, but in the developed countries. A majority were in North America and in Europe. More than 50%, you can roughly see this visually, of the deaths were in North America and Europe, with about 20% of the world population. So this has been one of the unusual instances of an infectious disease which has had much more serious mortality in the developed countries. Now, of course, part of the reason for that is differences in age structure, given the very steep age gradient of the mortality risks associated with this disease, which by now is well known, not always properly appreciated, I think, in the public communication about the disease risks, but certainly is well known to anyone who has studied the disease in any serious way. And of course, the age structure is widely discrepant. In Europe, roughly 20%, close to 20% of the population is over the age of 65. In North America, it's around 17 to 18%. In South Asia, it's about 5%, including in India, I believe it's about 5%. Others can correct me about the exact number. And in sub-Saharan Africa, it's as low as 3%. So just from that point of view, if you were to have asked the question, knowing what we know now, and actually what we knew even at the beginning about the age profile of the mortality risks, if we ask the question, what should be the appropriate governmental responses, treating all persons as equally worthy of attention from the standpoint of public health strategies, we should have had different answers to that question in different world regions. For example, the WHO and other organizations, the Gates Foundation and so forth, very much like a framework that they call disability adjusted life years. They've heavily financed the production of these numbers, which tell us ostensibly the number of life years that would be lost due to premature mortality, or that are being lost due to premature mortality from different diseases. One of the selling points of that framework is that it treats like for like. Life years of different persons are treated identically, life years gained or lost. Well, if one were to approach the problem in that way, treating like for like, then of course the fact that a disease is less threatening to a population by virtue of that population having fewer people threatened by it would be a relevant consideration in determining what is the optimal public health response, which is, of course, not to say that it should not be taken seriously, but that different risks to public health would have to be balanced. And I will come back to this issue later on. Okay. Now, here is a picture of confirmed COVID-19 deaths per million versus GDP per capita, level of GDP per capita. And you can see that for each of the world regions, which are color-coded here, there are wide differences in within each of these world regions in the number of confirmed COVID-19 deaths per million. But you can also see, and maybe this is a more direct interpretation of this particular graph, that for any given point on the horizontal axis, for any given level of per capita income, there's a wide variation in confirmed COVID-19 deaths. So again, not to tell you anything you don't know, but there have been very, very different levels of success, even for seemingly identical levels of societal resources with which to address the disease risks. And here, of course, I'm focusing only on COVID-19, not on mortality as a whole. I should have mentioned when looking at the previous chart, maybe I'll just go back to that just for a moment, whoops, if I can, that total mortality in the world in 2019 was something like 56 million. So 2 million is not a small number, but it's less than 5% of that level, which is confirmed COVID-19 deaths. Okay. Now let's look at this from a slightly different point of view, which is that of the cases or deaths per million. First, we'll look at cases, but deaths are a very similar picture relative to the GDP per capita growth rate, which was experienced in 2020. What we have done here is to combine the WHO data on cases or deaths in the case of the next slide with the IMF data as of the October World Economic Outlook projections, which are only partially revised in January. We've combined that with the WHO data. Now you can see that, again, with respect to growth rate, which is in some sense a measure of the economic price paid for the policy response to COVID-19 or the economic effects of COVID-19 jointly, that price paid was also widely variant for any similar level of cases per million. So if you take a point on the vertical axis, you can see a number of dots which are associated with that vertical level, which span a considerable horizontal area. And indeed, India, which has a relatively low number of cases and deaths per million in terms of the international comparison, is, however, not a favorable case from this standpoint, because it looks as if it paid a very high price relative to comparable countries which experienced a similar number of cases or deaths per million. Price understood here in terms of GDP per capita contraction. And again, others have already gone over that, so I won't go into the exact numbers there. But unfortunately, I didn't mark India on these graphs, but suffice it to say that India is toward the left-hand side. Which is to say it experienced a larger contraction for the same number of cases and deaths per million. Okay. Now, this is the same data presented by WHO regions. And what you can see here is that essentially all of the regions experienced sizable contractions, looking on the right-hand side column, with the one exception of the Western Pacific. So it doesn't so much show up in the inter-regional comparison, but really in the international, inter-country comparison within as well as across regions, that there were different prices paid. Now, if you were to look at the regions more specifically, one of the things that becomes apparent is that the WHO Southeast Asia region, which includes East Asia, is on the whole a more favorable case in the sense that there were smaller number of cases per million and deaths per million, as well as a smaller economic contraction. But there are outliers because South-East Asia includes a number of countries with very, very varying experiences. Okay. All right. Now, focusing on India specifically, as you all know, India had a very stringent lockdown at the beginning, in particular, and this is evident from the government Stringency Index, which is produced by some researchers at Oxford. Here I have exerted South Asia comparison with other South Asian countries. India is the pink line here. And so you can see that in March, April, India had one of the most stringent lockdowns and policy responses in the world, but that relaxed somewhat subsequently. Okay, you can't see it for the world, I should say here, but for the region, it was also the case for the entire world. It was deemed to have, in fact, at one stage by The Economist, the most stringent lockdown in the world. That was in March, late March. But as you can see in the South Asia comparison here, it relaxed somewhat in absolute terms, but also in relative terms. Okay. Now, what was the effect of that? Well, we all know that the effect was merely to delay the perhaps inevitable or perhaps not, but merely to delay, in the sense that the picture of the increase in cases, and of course, India has had fewer deaths per capita, but nevertheless, you'd find a similar picture also for deaths. The increase in cases returned to what might have been expected, or took on a pattern that might have been expected even if there had been no lockdown, once the lockdown was eased. So much so that India has come to have, of course, one of the highest number of total cases in the world. And it's far from evident that the lockdown made very much impact at all, other than in terms of the timing of this process. Okay. This is from the Financial Times just yesterday. Martin Wolf had a column describing the likely effect, ongoing effect of the pandemic in 2021, and here he has used OECD projections of the expected 2021 change in GDP relative to pre-pandemic projections, and you will see that India is expected, in the countries which are included here, at least in this OECD comparison, to have the largest decrease from pre-pandemic projections, even though it is anticipated that growth will recover in India. So that's a measure of the sizable cost, economic cost of the lockdown without very much health benefit. Okay. Now here is another angle on the question of the costs, which I think is hugely important, much more important, one might argue, than the economic cost as such. And this is what one might think of as the health trade-off that's involved. I wrote an article in the BMJ Global, one of the BMJ journals, in the summer last year, which made the point that there was very little evidence that countries had considered health trade-offs when formulating their policies, that they had even anticipated that there would be such trade-offs, let alone undertaken a rational balancing of the mortality and morbidity risks from different diseases, and in particular the likelihood that some of their policy response to COVID-19 would bring about adverse health consequences of other kinds. And that's been discussed in different particular ways in different countries. In the UK, for instance, there was a study done by the National Health Service which estimated that due to the lack of screenings for cancer in the first year of the pandemic, there would be an increase in the number of cancer deaths over a period of 10 years subsequently, which would be the same as the number of deaths from COVID-19 in the first year of the pandemic. And that was just from one particular cause of death, namely cancer. Of course, cancer is an important cause of death in developed countries, in all countries, but especially important proportionally in developed countries. Now, this table is from a study which was done by researchers in Canada in cooperation with UNICEF of the likely impact of the pandemic and the response to the pandemic, more importantly, the policy response to the pandemic, on mortality from various causes, especially as pertaining to children and mothers in the South Asian region. And this came out just last week. One of the headlines from it, which was quite disturbing, was that they argued, they estimated that the number of deaths, the total number of deaths from child and maternal mortality in the region has already exceeded the number of deaths from COVID-19. Let me be a little bit more precise about that. The number of additional deaths from child and maternal mortality that they estimate to have occurred as a result of the policy response from COVID-19 has already exceeded the total number of deaths from COVID-19 that is believed to have occurred in the first year of the pandemic. So that is, of course, quite concerning. That it necessarily is an estimate. It involves a subjunctive or a counterfactual, what would have happened otherwise based upon prior trends and what has actually happened. And of course, one could argue, and some people do argue, that in the absence of the stringent policy response to COVID-19 that was undertaken, there would have been even more COVID-19 deaths. So we're necessarily in a murky territory here, but nevertheless, looking at this estimated increase in child and maternal mortality is, I think, potentially very informative. And you can see from the table that India is estimated to have had within the South Asian region, experienced the largest increase in child mortality, one of the largest increases in neonatal mortality, just behind Pakistan, and also fairly large increases, and among the larger increases, both in stillbirths and in maternal deaths in percentage terms. And these are large numbers. 10%, 14%, 15%, 17%, large enough numbers that it's very hard to argue them away on the basis that there are heroic counterfactuals involved. On the contrary, it would seem that this type of comparison of deaths arising as opposed to those which would have been expected to arise based on the previous pattern is fairly convincing. One would have to, of course, go into the details of the model. Okay, I mean, it's fairly convincing that there was an effect. How large the effect is, one can discuss. All right. Now, I have not been keeping track of my time. I'm quite sure I must be running out of time or have run out of time. So let me just speak a little bit to the global dimension of the response, which Jayati, I noted, already examined quite thoroughly. I wanted to just add one or two words to what she has already said very sensibly about that. The first is that this is an instance of a global public good if ever there was one. A vaccine formula or a set of vaccine formulae, I think, very well satisfy the definition of a global public good. That in principle, they are non-rivalrous. It doesn't harm me for you also to have the benefit of that formula. In fact, it benefits me for you to have the benefit of that formula. Now, of course, it might harm Pfizer, but that's a distributional consequence, which could in principle be, in neoclassical a neoclassical economics framing of this problem be overcome through compensation of Pfizer. It's another matter that many of us might not want to compensate Pfizer, quote unquote, compensate Pfizer. But in principle, there is a gain that is experienced by world society as a whole by treating the formula as a public good. And it's not just, of course, the formulae for vaccines, but it's also other aspects of disease control and management which have this public good aspect. And yet, as we have seen, there has been a really shocking failure to treat the control of the disease and the development of technology, tests, as well as vaccines and other health commodities in this manner. And this failure of global cooperation is profoundly damning of global institutions and tells us that there is a very, very long distance to go in terms of creating the infrastructure of cooperation which can address such problems. The first instinct of countries has been to go in a nationalist direction, which has served the world public extremely badly. Now, let me just summarize that by saying that this is a global public failure, if ever there was one. Let me go a little bit more deeply into one particular instance, and I'll end with this, which Jayati has already talked about. The Covax mechanism, which was supposed to be a way to ensure access to any vaccines that were developed for the developing countries, or at least for a proportion of the population in the developing countries, only 20%, quite a modest goal, has, I think it is reasonable to say, quite comprehensively failed in terms of that objective, or it certainly looks at this stage as if it's likely to fail. It's unable to get hold of vaccines in the numbers required. And its contribution to vaccine development has probably been marginal, given its minimal overall role in the on the demand side among the various other buyers for these vaccines, including many others that have made advanced purchases themselves. Now, what has gone wrong here? I would suggest that this is unfortunately, a very, very good example of the way in which bad economic ideas, or economic ideas which might seem to be good in one context, whether or not they're even good in that context, end up having adverse effects in other contexts and at large, because of the tendency to promote them as fads or fashions or as fetishes. The concept of advanced market commitment, which underlies the COVAX mechanism, was put forward by Michael Kramer, the winner of the so-called Nobel Prize in Economics, along with Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo. It was not one of the works cited by the Nobel Committee, but it is one of the things for which he is well known. And it was originally proposed as a way to address orphan and neglected diseases for which there's inadequate demand, because the number of people who suffer from them is too small, or their willingness to pay is too small, perhaps because they are poor people in developing countries. And the seemingly clever notion underlying this was that well-meaning, benevolent donors, international donors, presumably governments or foundations such as the Gates Foundation, could create an inducement for firms to develop drugs or vaccines for these neglected diseases by making advance commitments to buy them if and when they came into being. Now, given that particular motivation, it's curious that this is the mechanism that would be applied here, since this is not an instance of a disease which lacks adequate demand. In fact, as Jayati pointed out, market analysts expect these vaccines to be very profitable for the companies involved. So it's being entirely misapplied from that standpoint, and it's a theoretical mistake to think that it would be applicable. It was completely anticipable that it would be not applicable. And one way to make this extremely concrete is that the rich countries which are begrudgingly financing COVAX to some extent are doing so with their left hand, so to speak, while with their right hand, they are themselves making advanced purchases in competition with COVAX and paying higher prices. And of course, COVAX is unable to win that battle. And it is simply unimaginable from a political economy point of view that it would be otherwise, that it wouldn't be the case that the right hand would win over the left hand. But this has never been discussed in the policy debate on whether advanced market commitments are the appropriate device. Instead, because the Center for Global Development and Michael Kramer and whoever else have been propounding this as the solution, Bill Gates, of course, it has been unthinkingly accepted, even though its failure could have been fully anticipated from this standpoint. And of course, there's the subtle or not so subtle point that the word market is central here. I'm not against market mechanisms, but in this case, I think one could argue there's a commitment to advanced markets rather than an advanced market commitment, in that there is no questioning of the claims to intellectual property rights, so-called intellectual property rights of the companies concerned, as there could be in an alternative people's vaccine approach, which would use eminent domain-like mechanisms to take over or to compensate firms for their intellectual property rights and then make them freely available as required. This is or not compensate them, depending on the public policy choices which are made. But one could argue that in different directions on that. But putting that to one side, the key point here is simply that there has been an inordinate focus on one particular mechanism, and I think that's because of the hold on our minds of a certain conception of how to approach this problem, which has everything to do with the dominance of particular ideas in elite institutions in the West and in the North, and the way in which those have been circulated by particular actors who have been sympathetic to them, ultimately including the WHO. That is more or less, I think, what I can or should say in the available time. I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.